Abroad Pod.
Hello, listener. Thank you so much for joining me on the 61st edition of the Teaching Abroad Pod. I'm your host, Rowan, and joining me this week is teacher slash program manager Thomas Davis, who's been helping teachers find rewarding short-term placements in Latin America since way back in 2010. But first, a little bio. Thomas has an MBA from Texas Christian University and a Texas state teaching license. He's taught in Mexico, Colombia, UAE, Sudan, Somaliland, and currently in Myanmar. He's the founder of Sueños Compartidos and helps teachers connect with schools in Colombia and Mexico. Welcome to the pod, Thomas.
Thank you.
So how did Sueños Compartidos get started?
I was in Colombia looking for teaching positions at universities. I had taught at a university in Mexico for a year and wanted to do the same in Colombia. While I was there, I visited a city called Popayan and did a horseback riding. I had a horseback riding guide, and he told me that he knew a family that wanted a live-in English teacher. And so I didn't have any other thing going on in Colombia. So I went to visit this family. They said, yes, we'd love to have you live in our house and teach our kids English. And so I arranged it and then realized that, or had the idea, I wouldn't be the only person who would be interested in being in this situation where you're not getting paid, but you have housing, you have meals, you have a very interesting cultural experience. And so towards the end of 2009, set up a website and started advertising on Daisy SL Cafe, and it grew from there. We ended up doing programs in Mexico as well as Colombia. We began working with Oxford 2012, and within maybe the past a week or week and a half, I just arranged for an Oxford graduate to go to Monteria, Colombia. She's arriving to Colombia in January, and she'll do some personal travel and then head over to work with our teacher there in Monteria for whatever time they've agreed to be together.
Awesome. So as you kind of mentioned, we've been working together where you can find teachers for your affiliated schools in Monteria, Popayan, for quite a number of years. So I know a bit about that, but could you sort of expand? Are those the only two locations, or do you have more that you're placing teachers in at the moment?
Currently, those two. The way the program works is that Sueños Compartidos is registered in Texas as an NGO. We don't use the term NGO in the US, but whatever the term is,
That are
we're
not for
registered.
profit?
Yes, that's it. So we don't have an organization in Colombia. The program is essentially me introducing interested candidates to the teachers in those two cities. There's one in each city. And then if that teacher is interested, which they've always been interested, if I have seen enough in the resume to then forward that profile. They're basically relying on me to do the screening. And then from there, I make the introduction between the teacher and the local coordinator, who's also the teacher they're partnering with, who's also the teacher they're going to be living with. And then from there, I'm really not involved. So they fly in, they're going in as a tourist, they're hanging out with a friend that I've introduced them to. And then they do whatever, not just teaching activities, but also social and cultural activities that teacher arranges. And the teacher benefits from getting a native English speaker not only into the classroom, but also hanging out with them. While there are a lot of tourists in Colombia, there's not much of an opportunity for an English teacher to interact with those people. And so this program is advantageous to the teacher, the Colombian teacher, as well as to the volunteer that we're introducing them to.
Absolutely. Sounds super mutually beneficial. I guess you don't get the number of tourists in Monteria as you would in Medellin or
That's right.
Cali or
That's
Bogota.
right.
And when can teachers start in each of those locations?
The school year in Colombia is semester one, February to maybe early June, and then semester two, August to end of November. So those are the main times because what we'd call the summer break in maybe the US or Canada or the UK is just a few weeks in Colombia, whereas the longer break is from December and January. So a volunteer can go in for anywhere from 1 to 4 months. And we've actually had people who have renewed for longer. You can stay 180 days in a calendar year. So you could go in for the August semester, finish it up, go to Ecuador for a few days, come back and do another semester. And we've had at least one person do that who never left. He married a Colombian and now lives and works in Colombia. So the answer
When you
is they
say
can start.
180 days, sorry to interrupt, but just to clarify,
Sure.
is that you can stay 180 and then leave and come back, or is 90 then leave and come back? So
You
I know
can
a lot
stay
of
180.
countries, it's like
So,
a 90-day tourist visa.
right. You get an extension in country. You don't need to leave.
Oh, okay.
Or however many extensions sum to 180 days. That's all you can get for a calendar year. You need to physically leave and then come back in a different calendar year to reset that clock.
Gotcha.
Most people do. Probably the average is 2 months. There's a lot of flexibility there. It's just a matter of whether there is a spot available in basically in the available bedroom of the teacher who's the local coordinator who's hosting the volunteer.
Right.
The host teacher is flexible because it's a nice opportunity for them. The pool of potential volunteers, they want the flexibility. They're not getting paid to do this. And so we've sort of over time structured it to have that flexibility, and it works great that way.
Well, I'm understanding a lot more about it now. It's amazing. We've been working together since 2012, and I didn't really understand how that the short-term nature was established or what people were committing to. So that's good to know.
Right,
Thank you.
right.
In terms of the teacher's commitment, how many hours per week are they in the classroom or on site at the school? Like, what's the sort of working hours, teaching hours breakdown?
It's 20 hours a week. What I request is to get 2 consecutive days free. That's not necessarily Saturday and Sunday, but with 2 consecutive days, they can hit the road if they want to make a road trip. And so 20 hours during 5 days a week. It could be morning, could be evening. In Monteria, it's more structured with more of a consistent schedule. Whereas in Popayan, it's more flexible, less structured. It's something between being a teaching assistant and the buddy of Luz Dottie, who is the local coordinator there. And so it just kind of depends on what she arranges and what people want to be doing. And so I give guidance to the volunteers who go that if you're going to Popayan, understand that what this is you getting the opportunity to come to Colombia, but don't expect a lot of structure. Don't expect to be overworked either. You might be underworked, or you might be teaching kids and you want to teach adults, or vice versa. So I give that heads up so that they don't have the expectation of something that they're not going to experience going in. I think the main concern would be how much time is it, as you're asking. Is this really going to be 20 hours a week, or is this going to be 12 hours a day? And it's not more than 20 hours a week.
Perfect. I always had the impression it was kind of as a public school teaching assistant, but if you're saying it might not be Monday to Friday, it could involve weekends. So what would the weekend work, quote unquote, work involve?
Those would be classes. It might be in the school, but it wouldn't be during school hours. It would be either at the school or another location. Teachers, sometimes in Popayan, they organize more of a general English class, and I don't know what the source of those students are. It tends to be a mix of teenagers and adults. They
Hmm.
may or may not be the teenagers, of course,
It's going
aren't
to be
school
like a
teachers.
free
Adults.
community English class or something like that.
Yes, and what the details are behind that, I don't know from Luz Dari. I just have communicated to her, you've got the volunteer coming in. Here are the kinds of things they want to do. Set up opportunities for that to happen, and that's what she's done.
All right, thanks for that. So as you mentioned, the teachers in Colombia get homestay housing and it's with the local teacher. So room and board is covered for their time with the local family and reminds me of doing that myself way back when in Cuba. And so I personally, I think it's a fantastic option to live like a local, learn the cuisine, the culture, the customs. You know, I still have a great fondness for playing dominoes and dancing merengue and all that stuff. So you don't have to sell it to me, but how do you sell it to other people who maybe are more used to having their own personal apartment or house and have never really lived with another family before?
It is optional. In fact, Mitra, the volunteer you've sent, is going to rent her own place and it's probably an age factor. I think I'm 53. I wouldn't want to do a homestay with Luz Daria or with Yanelis in Monteria. I would, but I wouldn't just want to go in to do that now. If I were to do something like this, I might make that arrangement as well. Most people going in want the homestay. They want Spanish, and they want to kind of have that experience. It's sort of a mix of backpacking and teaching. And that's what most people want for one reason or another. In Mitra's case, I think she's number 190 or 191. So I'm sure in that number, we've had more than one that's done that. So it's an option. And for the people who do want it, it is important to make sure that the expectations for that volunteer as well as for the host are realistic. So I inform them of the arrangement, which is you have your own bedroom, shared bathroom. It's a clean house. You're going to be having probably most meals with the family. If you want to go out, you can. You'll get a couple of days to be able to, if you want to do a road trip, you can. And so I describe it in that way. And there have been situations where people just didn't want to continue in the arrangement, but I don't think it was an issue on our part. I think it was just more of an issue of sometimes you go in and you do something it doesn't end up the way you thought it was going to be. And so we've had maybe 3 who left because they just didn't like the arrangement.
This wasn't for them living in someone else's house.
It might be the level of development that they weren't, and Colombia is relatively developed, but it just might not be at the level that somebody going in is comfortable with. And so they decide that it's not for them. But generally, given the way it's worked, I'm confident that the program is structured in a successful way. And I'm confident that I'm informing in a way that's accurate such that teachers aren't going in and arriving and experiencing unpleasant surprises.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like we were living in Costa Rica not too long ago, and it's fairly well developed by Central American standards, I guess, at least. And beautiful place, love it, but it's definitely still a bit of an adjustment. Like the roads are not great and not terribly safe in some cases, and
Yes,
there's little
yes.
scooters passing you on both sides. And like that's just the traffic, but it's a cultural adjustment in many ways.
That's right. And some people most people that want this kind of experience want that as part of it, want the surprises and have some sense that there will be some frustrating days. So that's part of going in, I think. Part of the benefit of it is learning how to deal with those adjustments. For me personally, having taught in the countries I've taught in, and the spectrum of level of development and culture, learning to adjust and accept and be a minority and realize that when something seems weird, it's probably me that's weird to everybody else. That's really been a great personal growth experience. So I think that for most people, again, it's not always enjoyable, but it's part of why you do it.
And are these host teachers, have they always been the same ones, or is there a little bit of turnover over the years?
Luz Darty has been hosting since 2010 or 2011, and Yanelis in Monteria maybe since 2015 or 2016. There were more cities. There were other cities that we were in and that we just haven't continued in. Part of it is the teachers don't want to continue to participate. Part of it is there's been, during Corona, there was just a complete drop. The last in-country volunteer was sort of running towards traveling north through South America to get out of countries that he couldn't stay in, and eventually got out of South America. But there was a while there, even after Corona and the country opened up, it took a while to get back to getting teachers in. So they're the only 2 coordinators we've had in these 2 cities. Right now, they're the only 2 cities where we have teacher coordinators that want the program. So we continue to work with them, and it balances. This most recent round, when I was doing some advertising, probably I started advertising just a few days after you sent me Mitra to get people in Popayan. We had more interest. 2 are going to Popayan, 1 the first half of the term, another the second half of the term. We had more people that wanted to do it. So it looks like it's back now after Corona. Maybe I'll look for another location, but it's not like it's not my full-time thing. So for
Mhm.
me, I have the relationship with Luz, I have the relationship with Yanilis, and if I can get them volunteers on a consistent basis, I'm happy, they're happy, the volunteers are happy. It's not meant to be like as big as it can be.
So there's potential for growth if the demand is there, but you're not really scrambling to grow it beyond what it is right now.
Right, that's right.
All right, good to know. You already touched on this a bit, but basically, teachers are going on a tourist visa for a short term. Is this always a visa on landing, or do they have to arrange this ahead of time in some cases? And are there any special visa instructions you give them to ensure they don't have any trouble at the on upon entry?
I send out immigration instructions, and that instruction list is basically a link to the Colombian immigration website. So anybody traveling into Colombia, I don't think is required to complete this form, but it expedites it. If you don't do this online form, they might ask you more questions on arrival. So you fill out a form and it asks things like your personal information, maybe do you have an exit ticket and when's the departure date, where are you going, where are you staying, what's your classification. And so the volunteer fills out that form, they get in line. Once they get up to the actual window, then they hand over the passport, their ticket, that printed form, and probably 80% of the time is the person at the window does not open their mouth. They just read, stamp, and hand the paperwork, and then pass the person on to go collect their luggage. So that's the process to get into the country. I think that is 90 days, maybe it's 60. I'm not sure which is right now, but whichever one it is, if someone wants to stay longer, then the coordinator will take them to an in-country immigration office. It's quite easy extension, and you can get up to 180 calendar days to stay in the country. After that, you're not allowed to be in the country unless you were to get a work visa or some other type of arrangement. And so most volunteers aren't staying for that long. But if they wanted to stay for like the full semester, that would be longer than what they get at the airport. But there's a way for them to do that without leaving the country.
And is it okay to say I'm here as a volunteer, or is it better that they say I'm here to visit my friend? Is there really a difference one way or the other?
They're not there as a volunteer in the sense of you have to complete that sentence with I'm here with a volunteer and my organization is, and we're not in Colombia. There's no organization in Colombia. So they're going in with either Yanilis or Luz Dari to they will be at a school volunteering, but it's not structured in that way where they're working with an NGO or they don't have a contract with any school. There's no contract. It's just going to stay with and teach with slash hang out with one of these two. So in the renewal process, again, at the window, there's very little communication. It wouldn't, I don't even know that how it would get to that kind of discussion. But at the renewal, I imagine that when Luz Darty's done quite a few renewals, and I'm not sure whether Yanilis has, but when they're going to have the conversation with the immigration officer, then the question is going to come up, well, where are you staying? What are you doing? How come you're staying longer? And I imagine that Luz Darty or Yanilis is then Colombia to Colombian, just saying, they're with me. They come to my school. They do some teaching. They're not getting paid. I host them. In some countries, that would create an issue, but that's not going to create an issue in Colombia.
Good to hear it. Where was I? Where was I? Oh, yes. Of all the places you've lived in the world, which one would you say was your favorite?
They're different. Myanmar, which is where I am now, is the answer. And the best evidence of that is I've stayed here 7 years. So the longest I had stayed anywhere before here was the UAE. I stayed in the UAE for 3 years. And when I came here, I didn't plan on it. It was just a sudden decision that I didn't have any plan regarding. So I just thought it'd be a year. And then after that first year, where I was living in a hotel, I didn't do any language study. I was having a good time, decided to come back for another year. Went back to the hotel, no language study. And then after that, I thought, I like this place. And I know, having lived in Sudan, I lived in the UAE and studied Arabic, but there's no need for Arabic in the UAE. It might even be a bad place to study Arabic, because anytime you're going to study a language, you need to find somebody who knows zero English. And it's really difficult to do that in the UAE. But I lived in Sudan. And when I was able to communicate in Arabic with the Sudanese, the experience was just incredible, like beyond communicating in Spanish in Colombia, because a lot of Westerners can communicate in Spanish. Not that I'm saying it's easy or difficult. It's just the sort of the penetration rate of learning Spanish among Westerners is much higher than the same for Eastern languages. So I thought, if I'm going to stay here any longer, I know what my experience was like in Sudan, and I want to make this more interesting. And so I started studying the language. I moved out of the hotel. I went into a local neighborhood and stayed in that house for 3 years. So that put me in Mandalay for 5 years. Left to go back to the US because of the teaching shortage in the US due to Corona. So I went back, but I only lasted a year. I came back to Myanmar, this time coming to Yangon. And so now I'm finishing up my second year. I'm going to go to Bangladesh. I'm going to volunteer at a university in Dhaka starting in August or September. So this is my last academic year for the moment. I mean, I was saying that a few years ago, and then I only made it 1 year in the US and rushed back. So what's been great about it is people are very welcoming. There is a relatively low level of development, a lot of poverty, income. The middle class kind of income levels are just $100 a month, less than that now,
Oh,
due
wow.
to the like economic issues relating to the political issues and the security issues. So the situation for the Burmese is challenging, but they're very welcoming. They're very humble. I've learned to live a much simpler lifestyle at an expenditure level that's much lower than I would have imagined myself living at. It's fun to go into pagodas. You can just sit down and you can just, sometimes I just go in and sit down and I read a book, like in the outside pavilion at the pagoda, or on the way to the tea shop. Now there's a group of puppies, and every other day I go and I feed them, and every day I go visit them and hang out with them. And sometimes I see school kids in my neighborhood and I have chats with them in Burmese, or sometimes they say something to me in English because they know some English from school and they want to practice. So those kinds of interactions are what make the experience really fascinating. What I'm doing in the classroom would be the same at any international school. I'm teaching math and English. But what I'm doing outside of the classroom is just really incredible. And I would say it's getting to experience the human condition in a way that you're just not going to experience in the US or in Europe, even in the UAE, which would be is an Eastern country. But coming to a country like Myanmar, and I had a very similar experience in Sudan, but even more interesting here, it's really intense in a positive way, that personal growth, personal experience aspect of being in this particular country, of being in Myanmar.
Sounds like it. Sounds like you've been in almost I don't know, like a meditative or a philosophical state while living there. It's really like, yeah, exploring the human condition.
Yes, I would. There's definitely a philosophical part to it, and I would encourage. I do encourage teachers that are in it now or starting to get into it, that you can look at not just the teaching aspect of it, but you can look at, what does my qualification get me? Which countries can I go to with this qualification? And what's the culture in those countries? And what's the language situation? So in my case, the money makers for me were the UAE, and it ends up being now in this school in Yangon. I'm getting double what I was getting in Mandalay because of getting a teaching certificate during the year I was teaching in the US between Mandalay and Yangon. But now I'm going to leave here and go volunteer at a university in Bangladesh, and I'll get on-campus housing and meals, but I won't have any salary. But I know I'll have a very interesting cultural experience. And
Wow.
so for teachers that are thinking about international teaching or already in international teaching, you can really like build it into a career. For some people, it's just something they do for a few years. But for, I think, many international teachers, it's something, it's a lifestyle. I encourage that perspective. Look at not just this is my teaching job now, but where you might be interested in going 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years from now. Even though that sounds far out into the future, that's the way I've developed my international teaching career. And it's been helpful to me to have some ideas in the back of my mind a couple years ahead of time of the details of what my options are, where I can go, and what I'd be doing, what I'd be earning. And that's been beneficial for me to think of my progression, my career progression in that way.
Sounds like it. And it's a great way to go about it where you can have some money makers, but also you got enough savings then to start up somewhere else is very different and maybe take a year of not making a ton of money, but you're having a totally different experience that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yes, exactly.
In terms of the food and drink, or what would you say the highlights? I mean, I love a lot of Asian foods, Thai food, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, but I can't say I've ever had a Burmese dish.
Right. You probably haven't because where would you do it? Even are you in New York City?
No, I'm in Toronto.
Okay. So there are Canada's very international, lot of immigration there. So somewhere there's a Burmese restaurant, but not many of them. So you'd have to hunt it down. The morning dishes are typically a noodle kind of dish. There's a lot of rice for the afternoon and the evening meals with typically a small meat portion, much smaller than a Western meat size, the size of a meat portion in the West. A
Probably the portion that we
vegetable
should be
dish.
having in the West, but aren't.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's no way. And even now, another factor for me is I eat much less meat, not just from the portion size, which I couldn't deal with the Western portions anymore, but from the standpoint of the vegetarian or the vegan or the
I
Buddhist
hear just
influence in
quickly
my
on portion size. I hear things are big in Texas. Maybe you can confirm that.
Yes, that's true. So even probably in restaurants in Texas, not every restaurant, but significant number of restaurants, you'd have bigger portions in Texas than you would in other US cities. And those are already huge compared to the portions of meat that you would have a meal with a meal here, which is great for health. If they could afford more meat, they probably would have more meat in Myanmar. But because of the income levels, meat is a luxury. So that's it. Morning, a lot of noodle-based dishes, which I really enjoy, and then the afternoon evening meals more of a, like centered on the rice and a vegetable, maybe some fish, some pork, some chicken, or maybe no meat product.
If you're a vegetarian, there's still lots of good options in Myanmar.
Yes, yes. You also the tea shop culture is great in the sense that I had lunch, which I had a noodle-based dish, and the girls always ask me, you don't eat rice?" Like they're really surprised that at lunch I always get a noodle base. You don't eat rice? I tell them in the US I might eat rice once a month. So I have a noodle dish, and then I order their typical tea drink, which is like tea with condensed milk. And then after that, you can sit as long as you want, and they have what in Burmese would translate into English as warm water, which doesn't sound very appealing, but it's basically like Lipton tea. And it's free, and you can drink as much of it as you want.
Oh,
So you can relax at the tea shop. Nobody's ever going to tell you to leave the table. Somebody might sit with you if it's crowded, but nobody's ever going to ask you to leave.
there's
And you can just read
no loitering sign across the wall.
the exact opposite. So that is just cool in the way that in a country that the economic development is so low, but you can go, they welcome you, and you can sit there and just drink that tea or not drink the tea, and you can stay as long as you want. And people will camp out for hours with their phone, video games, watching a movie, reading a book, whatever they might want to do. I really enjoy that aspect of the cuisine. It's not so much about what you're eating as about that tea shop environment, that tea shop culture.
Interesting. I'd like to try that one of these days. If I can ever get there.
Yeah, it's not a common destination, even less so currently, but it
Yeah.
is a really, really interesting place.
If we wanted to get into
And
the political situation, that would be a whole other episode, I think. Uh,
right, right.
but just culturally speaking, it sounds marvelous. So I'm
Yes, it
totally
really is.
different cultural aspect. We're getting closer to Christmas. A lot of teachers overseas are probably thinking about what they'll miss about being home for the holidays. It can be a really tough time for some people. But you've got a lot of experience with that, I guess. What advice would you have for teachers abroad during the Christmas season in terms of making the best of it and still having a good experience?
I don't go to the US during Christmas. I go to the US during April. We have a 3 week break for the Burmese New Year, and it's really, really hot. And it's really here, it's really, really hot. And it's really, really beautiful in Dallas, Fort Worth. It's perfect. I like to cycle. It's perfect for cycling weather. So that's when I go home. There have been 1 or 2 years where I skipped an annual visit to the US. And even with having now I'm into my 15th or 16th. This is my 16th year of international teaching. So to skip a year is tough. Regarding Christmas, I've been away long enough and in non-Christian majority countries. There are certainly many Christians in Myanmar, but it's not Christian majority. For me, Christmas isn't a big deal from the standpoint of the Christmas aspect of it. So when, based on my academic calendar, is a best time for me to be in the US, and that weather contrast, there's no better time to not be here than April. And that's about the best time to be in Dallas, Fort Worth. So for somebody maybe newer, or even if you're not newer, but you have a close family connection or more of an importance on Christmas, then if you can make it home, do the whole experience of being out of your country and away from your family and friends is harder at the beginning. I can remember in Chihuahua, the first international teaching position I had, crying, just laying in bed crying, not even like crying, just tears just falling, dripping down my face. And I'm
Oh.
wondering to myself, where did my life go? Like I have the coolest life I can imagine. It's 15 years later, but it was challenging at the beginning, and still sometimes it's challenging. But maybe that's the best advice I can give is if you are experiencing whether it's Christmas blues or some other challenge, you grow. It doesn't get easier. You change, you grow, and that's part of the deal. It's a benefit of being an international teacher. If you can go to your home, whether it's the US or the UK or wherever it might be, that's great. But sometimes you just can't. So give yourself some time, give yourself the freedom to be sad, but also understand that as you have more time in international teaching, you'll change and it will become easier. And your many aspects of the experience that are challenging, you'll see those as beneficial as you go.
Did you ever have one of those, friend groups, as the kids call it these days, where they're just like, we're gonna do a turkey, or we're gonna have some kind of event for the expat community in this town.
Right. I have personally, I've worked to not do a lot of expat community things to force myself to learn the language.
Oh, so
And
you're
so,
always like delving right in to the local
yes,
scene.
but it is great that you asked the question because there is in Yangon, for example, there's a Facebook group. Facebook's blocked, but everybody uses VPNs, so you can connect. And it's not just here; it's probably in any place you're going to be teaching at this point, unless it's really off the grid. That there's that opportunity. So it might not be that you're at home, but you do have the expat community. You have the opportunity to connect with them. I do advise not to get too attached because it's really easy to do everything in English, and it's really easy to get together and have a Thanksgiving turkey dinner or go to a restaurant where it's going to be food that you can order in English and you've eaten it before, or it's Western, or maybe it's Mexican or something Italian, these sort of things you're used to. So it's hard to do things more local, but if you do, it is a more intense but more fulfilling experience. So I'm not saying never hang out with the expats, but I am saying be careful, know ahead of time. It's easy to start doing that and never do anything else. And so have your plan set to give yourself the opportunity, the challenge and the opportunity of that growth by experiencing and participating in the culture.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. You could really miss out you could not experience that tea shop where you sit all day and experience the local culture.
You could be here for years and not experience that. And so whether you're in Myanmar or whatever the location is, pushing yourself to do those things is part of maximizing the experience. It's not just teaching English and making some money outside of your home country. It's a lot more than that. But you got to make sure you take a step to experience those opportunities.
Optimal personal growth. All right. What would you say is the greatest joy of being a teacher or a program manager or both?
Being program manager for Sueños Compartidos in Colombia, the best part of that is it's just like a thing I do, very, very part-time, but it's fun from the standpoint of I could do all this from the other side of the world, connect people. Luz Dariet and Yanelis are always happy to have volunteers. With very few exceptions, the volunteers are just thrilled with their experience. It's just a cool part of my life. It's fulfilling that I get to put people together in that way. It's not for money. It's just a good thing to do. And I enjoy that. From the standpoint of being a teacher, what I really enjoy is that in the classroom, it's just like any other classroom. So my middle school kids are crying, they're bleeding, they're trying to eat ballpoint pens. I mean, whatever. Now they're wealthy kids. I'm teaching an international school. The tuition is sky high, and so they're the elite. They're 12, and so or my high school kids, they're 16, 17, and the teacher. We have teacher meetings and department meetings and those sorts of things you do as a teacher. So it's really interesting to me that like once I walk in, I get there at 7:30 in the morning and we go home at 4. But during that time, it's a normal teaching job. But then as soon as I walk out the door, I get in the cab and I'm speaking Burmese. And then we get into traffic and then there's people selling flowers and bottled water walking up and down the street. And sometimes you'll see the military with an M16 or AK-47 or whatever that thing is. And then I get home and the security guards are there and I have a chat with them. I go to the tea shop on my bicycle. It's a whole nother world. So that to me, that crazy contrast it's never old. There are down days at school, frustrating days at school, but I always know at 4 o'clock I'm going out the door and it's gonna be another world. And that's what I find is the greatest thing. So that's not I'm making a contribution by educating the next generation. I hope I'm doing that, but for me personally, it's that weird contrast of how school-like every school is, but then when you're outside, how totally different it is from being in Fort Worth, Texas.
So you still get that every day, new, different, exciting,
Yes,
challenging.
every day, every day.
It hasn't gotten old after 15 years.
No, the country, sometimes it's time to change countries. And that's another great thing about this industry. In most jobs, even in the US as a teacher, if you're changing schools every 2 years, at some point, there's not going to be another school because they're going to look at that resume and they're not looking for somebody to stay for 2 years. But when you're teaching an international school, it's absolutely okay. There is no question mark if you've taught for a year or two in 6 different places. That's just that's how it works. That's what many teachers are looking for. Some go somewhere and stay for 10 years or longer, but some are moving around every year or two. Usually the school, if you're doing your job, is going to give you the opportunity to stay as long as you want. They want somebody, they need somebody. They know who you are and how you teach and how you work as a part of the school community. So you are generally choosing when it's time to move on.
Awesome. Well, that's about it for my questions. Do you have anything you'd like to add before we go?
No, I'll just say that I have appreciated the relationship. I've appreciated the volunteers you sent. I will say for anyone that is not even necessarily thinking about our program, but the Oxford seminar graduates, that I don't review the resumes you send. I mean, I look at it, I open it, but there's once I get the email, they're approved. I know that the quality of the program has produced a quality of teacher that is exactly what we need. But that's the result of the volunteers that you sent is it works it's just like that. Like the email comes in, approved.
Awesome. Glad to hear it. Well, thanks again. Thanks so much for joining me on the Teaching Abroad pod. It has been a great pleasure to have you and to finally meet you face to face, as it were. And thanks to everybody for tuning in to the Teaching Abroad pod. We'll be releasing new episodes monthly for the foreseeable future. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe and share it with your friends. Remember, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the usual places. And if you have any great ideas you'd like to hear us discuss in upcoming episodes, leave them in the comments on YouTube or email us at teachingabroadpod@oxfordseminars.com. Enjoy biking around the Philippines, Thomas, and happy holidays to everyone else.
Thanks so much, Roy.